Okay, so I'd like to thank the organizers for asking me to talk about cerebellum and schizophrenia. So we've been working on this for the last few years. So I'll present a few of the findings from that. So just to get a brief talk outline, first I'd like to talk about very briefly about schizophrenia, and then some of the reasons why it's a good idea to study the cerebellum in schizophrenia. Next, I'll go on to try to answer some of the questions that we've been addressing. So first, is the cerebellum reliably affected in schizophrenia? So I'll present a study we did on that. And I'll also present a study where we looked at cerebellum morphology in adolescence and whether that could be associated with subclinical psychotic symptoms. So early signs of possible schizophrenia. I'll also very briefly mention some ongoing work there where we're looking at possible genetic overlap between cerebellar morphology and schizophrenia. And finally, I'll briefly look at some remaining questions and future directions to try to highlight that. So this work has been done in collaboration with a lot of people, some of whom are seen here. And in addition to these people who did a lot of the work, we're also indebted to large publicly available data sets. So a lot of these studies have been using some of these publicly available, or at least available for research data sets, such as the UK Biobank and SchizConnect, the Philadelphia neurodevelopmental cohort, and so on. So schizophrenia. So it's a complex set of symptoms, or syndrome with many symptoms, and it's usually thought of as composed of positive symptoms such as hallucinations or delusions, but also negative symptoms such as the lack of motivation or social withdrawal. And over the last 30 to 40 years, it's been increasingly recognized as a lot of cognitive symptoms in schizophrenia as well, such as poor memory and communication difficulties in attention. In very recent years, it's also been clear that the schizophrenia extends beyond the mind and the brain. So there's also immune dysregulation, inflammations in there, and quite increased prevalence of cardiovascular symptoms. And more relevant to the cerebellum, there's also quite massive evidence for motor symptoms in schizophrenia, often conceptualized as neurological soft signs. So impaired coordination, for instance, is one of these. When understanding schizophrenia, it's also important to look across time. So you typically get a diagnosis of schizophrenia or a manifest disorder in early adulthood, late adolescence. But there's a lot of things going on before that. So you have this critical phase in adolescence where you see a functional impairment. So basically you have the symptom intensity or severity on the y-axis and age on the x-axis. So things start to go awry in adolescence. And then in addition to that, there's also very strong evidence for quite a considerable heritability. So genetics also play a role. So if you try to map these symptoms onto time, you can see that there's some cognitive, motor, and social impairment. Some of these symptoms are present already from childhood throughout life. And then some of the more clear psychiatric symptoms emerge later on. But some symptoms are present very early. And why study the cerebellum in schizophrenia? One obvious reason is the motor impairments you see. So many of the most frequently observed motor symptoms are really suggestive of cerebellar dysfunction. And some of these can be seen really early, so as early as age 7 in children at high risk. And this has also been shown in experimental tasks known to rely on the cerebellum, such as classical conditioning and eye blink reflex. There's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that is abnormal in at least a large subset of patients with schizophrenia. But there's also the cognitive impairment, and over the last few years, it's been becoming increasingly clear that the cerebellum is involved in a lot of cognitive tasks. So this is from a recent paper by King et al., where they show not only motor representations of the cerebellum using fMRI tasks, but also lots of quite large parts of the cerebellum devoted or activated by more cognitive tasks, suggesting an involvement in cognitive function. Also suggesting the same thing, you can have lesions in the cerebellum that affect cognition, but not motor function, and vice versa. So lesions can selectively affect motor or cognitive function. So also the cognitive impairments in schizophrenia might suggest cerebellar involvement. There's also a social impairment that you see early on in schizophrenia. And there's also increasing evidence for a role in social cognition for the cerebellum. So this is one review by Sokolov, Mayal, and Ivory a few years back. And also relevant to social function, you can see that autism, where the social impairment is one of the main impairments in that disorder, and where quite a few symptoms actually overlap with schizophrenia, cerebellar injury is a large risk factor. Okay, so several of the early affective symptoms in schizophrenia, such as motor, cognitive, and social function, might indicate cerebellar involvement. So is the cerebellum reliably affected in schizophrenia? There's been both, there's been quite a few smaller studies earlier on, but with some conflicting results. So a few years back, we wanted to pool participants across many sites. So we used some European samples from the ImageMed consortium and added on some American samples from openly available data sets. And altogether, we got 983 schizophrenia patients and 1,349 healthy controls in this study. And what we did was to use MRI processing pipelines optimized for the cerebellum. Most previous studies, MRI studies on schizophrenia, has not used cerebellum optimized pipelines. And then we basically computed the effect of having a diagnosis while controlling for age, sex, and intracranial volume. And meta-analyzed this across the different samples. So results. So we got across these different groups. So anything on the left side of the dotted line suggests an decreased volume of the total cerebellum in schizophrenia. And across samples, this is where the data seems to indicate mostly. There's some variation across samples. The effect is not as large in all samples, but when we pool all this together, we see a highly significant volume reduction for the total cerebellum in schizophrenia. So while this is highly significant, it's also important to note that this is, the groups overlap a lot. So these are the estimated volumes after correcting for age and sex for schizophrenia healthy controls, and you see a huge overlap, even though the means are highly significantly different. This is for the total cerebellum. So if we look at more regional cerebellum volumes, what do we see? So we can see that when we look at lobules or traditional anatomical postulations, we can see that we see the largest group differences in the left and right lobule 10, as well as cruise 1, cruise 2. We see pretty much the same thing when we do this across all voxels. So here we've collected all the samples together and done a mega-analysis instead of a meta-analysis, and identify different voxels in the cerebellum where volume is decreased in schizophrenia patients relative to health controls. There are other ways of postulating the cerebellum, which I'm sure other participants in this conference have talked about. One way of doing that is to use resting state fMRI. So you look at the bold signal during the fMRI scan and see regions where this bold signal goes up and down together. So you see correlation between different regions of the brain. So this is called functional connectivity. If you do this for the cerebrum, you can see regions such as the frontoparietal network in orange, where the whole signal tends to be correlated, or the default mode network, but also correlated within this red or pinkish region. If you do this, look at, so Buckner, it says Yo, but it's Buckner, a few years back, used these cerebral networks, and they said, okay, for this network, what regions of the cerebellum are functionally correlated with these? So basically got a postulation of the cerebellum based on the cerebral networks they show the highest correlation with. And we used this network, this postulation in this study. And when we did that, we saw that the regions that show the largest difference between schizophrenia, largest reductions in schizophrenia, were the frontoparietal networks and default mode network. So basically the regions of the cerebellum that show the highest functional connectivity with regions of the cerebrum that we know are involved in higher cognitive function, that's where we saw the largest difference between patients and controls. Okay, so we see these reductions in schizophrenia, but how do these compare with other brain-wide changes? And I apologize in advance for the next slide, which is quite busy. This is just comparing the effect size or the group difference between all these cerebellar features and a lot of brain-wide brain-wide anatomical features, such as cortical thickness in different regions or volumes of subcortical structures. So I just want to highlight that the cerebellum RY6, which is basically connected to the frontoparietal network, shows pretty much the same effect size as the hippocampus on top of the list. So cerebellar volume reductions are among the most pronounced and consistent anatomical changes in schizophrenia. Interestingly, across samples, the variability as indexed by the I2 index, the variability across samples was less for the cerebellum than for the hippocampus. Okay, so is the cerebellum reliably affected in adult schizophrenia or the manifest disorders? I think we can say yes. At least this study suggests so. But the cerebellar morphology in adolescence, so in this early phase where the disease starts, is that also associated with subclinical symptoms of psychosis? So for this study, we used the Philadelphia neurodevelopmental sample from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which consists of over 6,000 participants that have done behavioral and clinical assessments, as well as genotyping, and this neuroimaging MRI for about 1,400 of them, at least in this study. So what we did was we used the cognitive and clinical scores and did a decomposition, data-driven decomposition of that. Doug Alnes did this work, and got one sort of principal component for the general psychopathology. I'm just going to skip that. And 7 more specific clinical indices. So these are different questions that load onto the same independent components. And one of these really have questions that tap into psychosis. For instance, I believe that I have special natural or supernatural gifts beyond my talents and natural strengths. Or I feel that it could possibly be something interrupting, controlling my thoughts, feelings, or actions. So we used this clinical component and wanted to see if any cerebellar morphology could be associated with that or could predict these scores. So here we also did a data-driven decomposition of cerebellar gray matter from all 1,400 subjects, and that gave us 10 independent components. And these map onto, largely reflect patterns of functional connectivity. So if we look at to take these seeds regions and then look into functional data sets to see what regions which regions of the cerebellum are correlated across time in a resting state fMRI study, then you, not completely, but you partially recover the same networks. And we can then also ask what cerebral regions are connected, show functional connectivity to these cerebellar ROIs, and finally, you can then see in the literature what kind of terms are usually associated with this. So you see, basically, the idea here is that you see some of these, for instance, cruise 1, that is strongly associated with ICD-03, strongly associated with verbal working memory, rehearsal, retrieval, calculation, so cognitive tasks. Whereas you see some other of these components that are more strongly related to motor tasks, for instance. So yeah, motor, movement, action. This is one way of trying to decode what these might mean. Anyway, we use these features and then try to predict individual scores on this psychosis component using machine learning with tenfold internal cross-validation. So basically what we do is we use 90% of the sample to create the best model, trying to predict these scores from the morphological features using shrinkage linear regression. And then we test how well that model is on the 10% that was not used to create the model, so on an unseen sample, independent sample. So we do that 10,000 times. So we start doing that 10,000 times on randomly permuted data, so we get a distribution of what it's like when we know that there's no association. And then we test associations across these 10,000 samples and see what the distribution of correlations between predicted and actual scores becomes. And then we know this randomly permuted data basically gives us a significant threshold that we can use. So anything beyond this dotted line is a significant association. And what we find is that we can predict general cognitive function, general psychopathology, anxiety, conduct disorder, and psychosis by using these cerebellar features as input in this age group. So again, what about other brain features? How well do they predict cognitive function and psychiatric symptoms? So how does this compare to other brain predictors of symptom severity? So if we use subcortical volumes, they do predict general cognitive function. They also predict OCD, just above threshold. Cortical thickness does predict general cognitive function better than cerebellar volumes, but not psychosis. So cerebellar features do seem to do better. Another way of comparing that would be to throw all the different anatomical features into the same model, and then see how important the different features are. So you can get an estimate of that as well. So if we then do predict the cognitive function and these other clinical components from all anatomical features, so subcortical volume, cerebellar features, and cortical thickness, again we see significant prediction. But now we can then ask the second question: what's the most important features for psychosis? So what did the model really need in order to predict psychosis? And that's where we get this cerebellar feature that emerges as the most important brain-wide predictor of psychosis in this analysis. And this part of the cerebellum shows functional connectivity with this default mode network again. So it seems to be the regions of the cerebellum that are functionally connected to higher order cognitive functions that show that, as showing the most effect in schizophrenia, also are the most important for predicting psychotic symptom severity in adolescence. And you can see that again here. There's partial overlap between cerebellar regions affecting schizophrenia on the left and those associated with subclinical symptoms in adolescence in this large adolescent sample on the right. So the overlap is really mostly in cruise 1, bilateral cruise 1. So going back to this figure, so is cerebellar morphology in adolescence associated with subclinical symptoms? I think we can answer yes. At least this suggests that there is such an association there as well. So, but there's also this heritability. So this huge, it's quite definite genetic component to schizophrenia. So another question that could be interesting to ask then is the genetic overlap between cerebellar morphology and schizophrenia? And there are studies out there showing genetic variants that increases the risk of schizophrenia from these huge genome-wide association studies. So this is a Manhattan plot. So on the x-axis here, you see the different chromosomes. On the y-axis, you see the log significance of the association for each genetic variant. And anything above this line here is genome-wide significant. So these are then corrected for performing these millions of comparisons. So basically, this is a genetic signature of schizophrenia based on 34,000 patients and 45,000 health controls. So next, using the UK biobank sample, where we have imaging data and genetic data for, I think, about 42,000, maybe even more now. They're aiming for 100,000. Anyway, after quality control, we had cerebellar gray matter volume estimates for 27,000 participants. So we did a genome-wide association study on that. So now we get this genetic signature of total cerebellar volume. And once we have these, we can compute genetic correlations. So the short story here is that for total brain volume, total cerebellar volume, that we see a significant negative association with schizophrenia. That is a variance that increase the risk of schizophrenia tend to be associated with smaller total cerebellar volume. These are not large effects, but they're significant. And more importantly, I think, is that when we redo this across many other anatomical features, such as subcortical volumes or average cortical thickness or total surface area of the brain, they show less of an association in this sample. So again, the cerebellum seems to be among the brain features that show the strongest, if not very strong, but at least the strongest associations with schizophrenia genetic. This is a work in progress, so there's lots more to be done here, but there are so it's a genetic overlap between cerebellar morphology and schizophrenia. Maybe this is still work in progress. So, but at least these preliminary results suggest as much. So finally, I would like to address some remaining questions and future directions. So what I've shown you so far is really strictly correlational. So one problem is that there's lots and lots of possible confounds in these data. So there's groups might differ on alcohol consumption, body mass index, many things that might affect cerebellar volume. We have tried to control for a lot of these in these studies. So, for instance, alcoholism does not seem to be something that, or consumption does not seem to be something that that explains this association in the schizophrenia sample that I showed you. And we also controlled for quite a few different factors in the adolescent sample. So even, for instance, even if we control for overall general psychopathology or general cognitive function, this association with psychotic symptoms still holds. But there's still a lot to be done. So this is a figure from a fairly recent paper I did with Richard Ivory, where we tried to summarize what's more basically the evidence base for a link between the cerebellum and the symptoms of schizophrenia. And what we wanted to highlight here was that we need to link anatomy to mechanisms and then finally to symptoms. And some of these links are more well established than others. So for instance, for motor control, you could say some of the motor symptoms of schizophrenia, so impaired coordination or postural sway, might be associated with impaired mechanisms, cerebellar mechanisms that optimize motor control, but basically predicted sensory consequences of actions, for instance. And the link between the cerebellum and such mechanisms is strong. The link to motor symptoms in schizophrenia is less strong, but moderate. For other different symptoms of schizophrenia, these links are weaker. But this is just trying to present some sort of roadmap of the links that we need to fill in. Also, in this diagram, we try to go from sort of more basic motor symptoms through sensory motor functions, and then gradually more abstract and cognitive. So we also need to generalize computational mechanisms and neural circuits from motor control to higher cognitive function. And if we do this, to try to link the different levels of explanation and to generalize these mechanisms and link that to the symptoms of schizophrenia, then I think we can do a thorough test of this hypothesized link. Yeah, so I hope I've gotten you interested in trying to fill out some of these links. I think one thing that's especially important is lesion studies. So there are some anecdotes of psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia following cerebellar lesions, but they're not that. It's not a very strong evidence base yet. So trying to systematize that would be very, very useful. And there are some, so I think that's one of the things that we really need to do. And then I think I've almost used up all of my time. So thank you for your attention, and would love to discuss this in the discussion session. Thank you.